Let me welcome you to the freest state in these United States. For the last year and a half, we've stood up against entrenched bureaucrats and a partisan corporate press corps to keep Florida open and to protect people's rights to work, businesses' right to operate, and the right of kids to go to school in person. While other states kept locking people down, Florida lifted people up. We did not subcontract out leadership to Dr. Fauci. In fact, I look back during the whole COVID situation and I saw governor after governor just hide behind the bureaucrats and do all these destructive things. I look back and read Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address. Many of you recognize it for the military-industrial complex warnings, which were on point. But there's another passage in that address where he talks about how the rise of scientific research funded by the government was intermingling and potentially distorting public policy. And he said, you cannot allow public policy to be held captive by one segment of society, in this case, these scientific elites. He said statesmen have to harmonize the different interests, and you got to make sure you're looking at the broad view and not simply doing what one element of society tells you to do. And so I resolved in the state of Florida, we would be a free state. We would not allow our state to descend into a Faucian dystopia in which people's freedoms were curtailed and their livelihoods were ruined. We chose freedom over Fauci-ism, and we're better off for it. In fact, you will never see this on the media. For the last many weeks, Florida has had the lowest COVID rate in the entire nation. They don't want to tell you that. They don't want to talk about it going up in these other places. So we're proud of being a free state. We're also proud on leading on issue after issue. The state of Florida, we have the lowest per capita tax burden in the entire 50 states. And although we meet the key needs of the state, our budget is something that's very conservative. New York is the closest state to Florida in terms of population. We now have about 3 million more people than New York. And yet New York, well, partially because many of them have moved here. But if you compare our budgets, even though we have 3 million more people than the state of New York's budget is over twice the size of the state of Florida's budget. And yet, do they have better infrastructure than Florida? No. Better roads? No. Better K-12 education? Not even close. And so we do it right, and I think the proof's in the pudding about how we're doing with the economy and having an open state. In September, the U.S. reported about 194,000 new jobs nationwide. Florida's share of that was 84,500 jobs. Since I became governor, I've appointed 5 constitutionalists to the Florida Supreme Court, and we've taken, and in doing so, we transformed perhaps the most liberal state Supreme Court in the country into the nation's most conservative Supreme Court in the country. I've signed legislation banning sanctuary cities and protecting women's sports. When I became governor, I recognized that you can't wait for crises to develop. Yeah, there are things that happen that you just have to respond to for sure, but there's also things you can get ahead of. And so I came in my inaugural address, I said, for the state of Florida, 1 generation of botched elections is enough. We're going to make sure we do it right. And one of the first things I did as governor was accept the resignation of Brenda Snipes as a supervisor of elections in Broward. And we got rid of the Palm Beach County supervisor of elections, which had also had a lot of problems. And the result was and when COVID came, we didn't change any rules. We followed the law. We followed the rules. The result was we counted 99%, 11 million votes by midnight on election night. It took many of these other states weeks to count ballots. And we did it transparently and we did it effectively, but I also understood that you got to stay ahead of the game. And so several months ago, as Kay mentioned, I signed the strongest election integrity reforms in the country. We banned ballot harvesting in the state of Florida. We prohibited mass mailing of unsolicited ballots in the state of Florida, and maybe most importantly, we banned Zuckerbucks in the state of Florida. And never one to rest on our laurels. In the next legislative session in January, I'm proposing even more reforms. We are going to create, I think the first in the nation in the Department of State, an election crimes and integrity unit where we'll have prosecutors, investigators, and sworn law enforcement so that people will be held accountable if they violate our election laws. We're also leading the fight against some of Biden's reckless policies. We're suing him over his catch and release border policies. We're also looking to penalize private contractors that are being used to bring and ferret these illegal aliens into our state. And I said, they do it in the middle of the night. They don't tell us, but if I can get that and know, I will send them to Delaware. Because you know what? If we sent to Delaware or Martha's Vineyard or all these other places, they would stop and secure the border immediately if that's what happened. So we're going to work on it. We are the first state to enact protections for Floridians against big tech censorship. And it's being litigated now in the 11th Circuit. I think we're going to be successful, and if we have to tweak, we will tweak. But we are not going to let the speech in this country be controlled by a half dozen oligarchs in Silicon Valley. When American cities started burning last summer, I immediately called out the National Guard in the state of Florida, and we said that is not happening here in our state. And we've since signed the strongest anti-rioting legislation anywhere in the country, where we tell people very, very clearly, if you riot, if you loot, if you're engaged in mob violence, we are not going to do like Portland, where you get arrested, slap on the wrist, mugshot, and get put right back on the street to do it again. If you do that in Florida, you're not getting a slap on the wrist, you're getting the inside of a jail cell. We've also enacted protections for Floridians against local government efforts to defund the police. If they defund police, we put the money back in and protect our citizens. Florida has also banned critical race theory in our K-12 schools. We're not spending tax dollars to teach our kids to hate our country or to hate each other. That is not going to happen here. And as Biden has blundered on the economy and the supply chain, and you see ships sitting idle on the coast, Florida has stepped up and said, bring them here. We have capacity. We work 24/7 all the time, and we will relieve the logjam. Florida has rejected the biomedical security state by banning vaccine passports. Prohibiting COVID vaccine mandates on school children, And we will be holding a special session of the Florida legislature next week to make sure that in the state of Florida, nobody has to choose between the jab and their job. And we're also fighting against Joe Biden's COVID vaccine mandate. This is something that curtails people's individual freedom. The federal government has never imposed a vaccine mandate on the American population. Even Biden admitted this is something that he couldn't do. At the end of the day, this is a personal decision for people to make. And, you know, this idea of mandate apart from the federal government, the mandate is supposed to mean if everyone does it, then no one will get COVID, but we know that's not true. We know people are still getting infected. It does not stop the spread, and so it's fundamentally a misguided policy, but we're going to make sure people have the freedom to do it. We also recognize the damage it's going to have on our economy. When you look at how this would impact key sectors, healthcare with these nurses, truckers, all these other areas, if just 1% of them fall off and lose their jobs, you're going to see huge, huge problems, and that's going to have a ripple effect all throughout the American economy. It's also somebody, as a guy who ran saying he was a uniter, this is absolutely destroying the social fabric in our country. This is causing people to never trust any of these folks ever again. If there is situations where you have some of these medical people that offer advice, no one's going to believe them anymore. And so it's been very divisive, and it's been unnecessarily divisive. And I also think to myself, you know, they justify it saying for science, but yet the OSHA rule rejects immunity through prior infection. They don't recognize the immunity that has been documented in Israel at the Cleveland Clinic. All these studies have shown that if you recover from COVID, you have protection. And yet they don't recognize that at all, and they literally want to fire somebody who's immune already for not getting the jab, even though that person has better protection than the people that have something like the Pfizer. It makes no sense. And as much as I think it is important that people can make these decisions, and I believe in freedom across the board, but particularly in this case, medical freedom, in reality, what Biden is doing is not even really about the vaccines. I mean, the vaccines are maybe the issue that's causing this to come to the fore, but this is fundamentally about an abuse of federal power and unconstitutional use of the federal government. And so we are, joined with other states, and I think we'll get probably a positive result as long as it stays in the venues that are considering it right now. But if they can get away with this, because there's some people I talk to who are already vaccinated, they don't think it affects them. I said, well, first of all, it will. And I said this the other day, and the media got mad, but it's true. 6 months from now, if you have 2 shots, you're going to be considered unvaccinated. They will deny that now. I understand that. But just remember, they said it was only going to be 15 days to slow the spread, and look where we are. So that's going to happen. And so, but I tell people, after this issue, if the federal government can get away with this, they're going to be able to get away with a lot more, and next year maybe it's something you care about, or 2 years from now. So it's important that we take a stand, and it's important that we say no mandates, no restrictions. We're not going to let you take away our freedoms, and the states are standing up. So one of the neat things since I've been governor and now is when you talk to folks, and we've always been known for our beaches, our theme parks, all these other things, and we're proud of that. But now we're really known for freedom. And you have people all across this country that are voting with their feet. And what we've seen happen, particularly over the last 2 years, has been not just a typical migration, because we've had people come to Florida for a long time. It's really been a political migration of people who are leaving lockdowns. They're leaving badly governed states. They're leaving high crime states. They're leaving all these problems to come to a state that does it well. When I got elected governor in November of 2018, there were almost 300,000 more registered Democrats in the state of Florida than Republicans. And as I stand here before you today, 3 years later, for the first time in the history of the state of Florida, there are more registered Republicans than Democrats. And this is providing quite a contrast to the Biden regime's failures in ineptitude that we see on display day after day. Biden, he's obsessed with what Florida's doing. He singles us out more than anybody, always attacking the state, attacking me. And I think to myself, like, look, I'm a big boy, I don't care. But I think to myself, you know, if he spent half as much time doing his job as commander-in-chief than he does criticizing Florida, we would have 13 service members that would still be alive today who were killed in Afghanistan because of his negligence. And so the daily humiliations that we see under Biden, the open border, spiking gas prices, inflation, which they said was not going to be sustained, the supply chain, the disaster in Afghanistan, his failures on COVID. He demagogued Trump and said that he would shut down the virus, and the virus was Trump's fault. And yet, there have been more people, tragically, that have died of COVID under Biden than under Trump, and they didn't even have therapeutics or vaccines for most of the time Trump had to deal with COVID. So he's failing across the board, and I think it's causing more and more people to look and recognize the failures of leftist governance. And in point of fact, Biden really represents potentially the culmination of, or I mean, hopefully the coup de grace of, this entrenched political class that has really ruined a lot about our country over the last generation. And it's not limited to just Democrats, okay? There's a uniparty in Washington, D.C., and they look out for themselves more than the rest of the American people. These are people that support things like open borders. Yeah, Biden's bungling it. Yeah, he doesn't, I mean, he's 6 fries short of a Happy Meal. He definitely doesn't know what's going on. But they don't believe in national sovereignty. They're globalists. They think they're citizens of the world. They don't think there's anything distinctive. Our ruling class doesn't think anything distinctive about American citizenship. That's why they would consider paying reparations to people that came across our border illegally, because they think people have a right to come regardless of the laws and Constitution of the United States. If you look at the Afghanistan debacle, yeah, it was a total foreign policy failure, but quite frankly, we've seen a lot of them over the last generation. The Iraq campaign, which I served in, and many people served honorably, and the military did a lot of good things, but has not left us safer. You look at things like the incursion of Libya. Again, these are half-cocked missions that are really only supported by Americans' ruling class, not the rest of the American people. These elites have done more than anybody to facilitate the rise of China. And the fact of the matter is, had they not done most favored nation and done all this stuff for China, China would be much weaker today. The U.S. ruling class has been China's best friend, and now we look at them as by far our most significant adversary. But they've done a lot of damage on our industrial base, on our supply chains, but they absolutely own that. And you look at the next 3 years, what China's going to do. They watch Biden floundering around. These people are really tough. They're going to make sure that they exact a huge amount of price based on Biden's failures. And that is not just Biden. That is a whole cadre of these elites. And the thing is, nobody's ever held accountable. If you're in the club in D.C., there's no accountability. How the hell else does Fauci still have a job? And even in the rare instance where somebody's actually held accountable, like when I was in Congress, we were going after people like Comey and McCabe. McCabe actually got held accountable. And then what do? They reinstate his benefits a year or two later. And I was in the Congress when you see things like the abuse of the IRS, and nobody ever gets held accountable. And part of the reason that's true is because we have a very corrupt and partisan corporate media in this country, and they really serve as the Praetorian Guard for these elites. They're propping up Biden's regime day after day to the best that they can. And what's happened is it's not just a liberal bias. Liberal bias is, okay, you know, we agree with the facts and we kind of shade it from a liberal direction. They don't do facts anymore. They do partisan narratives. And when there are facts that hurt their partisan narratives, they ignore the facts or they actively try to suppress the facts. And the people who stand up and speak the truth that can destroy their narratives, media just tries to smear them. You know, they mention they come after me. I just stand my ground. I don't let them get away with it. But that's what they do to people. And so the partisanship, the gaslighting, the ignorance of facts, all this ends up creating a blizzard of lies that is designed to blind the American people from the truth. And I look back and think when I was in the Congress, I was in for 4 years of Obama, and then I was in when Trump got elected in 2016. And what happened when Trump gets in? The media concocts a conspiracy theory about Russia collusion, which was totally false. Most Republicans, though at the time in my chamber, agreed with it. I was one of like 3 who spoke out against it from the beginning, because it was obviously these people lie. But there are a lot of Republicans that think the media tells the truth and they defer to the media, but they don't. They lied from the very beginning. They knew they were lying, but they didn't want to accept the results of the 2016 election, and they were trying to drive Trump out of office in any way they can. And they had a lot of help from the entrenched bureaucracy in D.C. as well. The whole lot of them need to be cleaned out up there. They're destroying our country. And I look at Biden and floundering, and, you know, you see, you know, this Brandon stuff is, I think it's funny. I mean, the media gets mad at me. I think it's funny. But the thing about it is, you know, this is not just, you know, people like a conservative function that do this. You'll hear these Biden chants in like the streets of New York City, all over. It's just like the nationwide, the American people overwhelmingly recognize the emperor has no clothes. And I think that's an impressive amount of failure, because the media tries to blind us to that every single day, and people see right through it. And so we have a situation where he's actually become a punchline to the majority of the American people. So the media is not, they're upset about it. That's why they don't like Brandon, because it shows that what they're doing isn't working. But they have help. And so when the media can't pull the wool over people's eyes, what do now, these elites? They go to the big tech companies and they just ask them to snuff out the truth. They ask them to deplatform people that are inconvenient to the narrative. They ask them to censor things. I mean, if you had said in March of 2020 that lockdowns were bad, that the virus came from Wuhan Institute of Technology, they took you off the internet. They censored you. Those views couldn't even be out there. And these are like very important issues to be discussing. And so big tech, when they first came into being, really was liberating, particularly for conservatives, because you could go around the legacy press. It didn't matter what they said, because you could share the truth with people. They don't like that anymore because, quite frankly, Trump used it effectively. And so now, instead of being open, liberating platforms, they really serve as almost a council of censors on society, where they're trying to uphold the narrative at all costs. And in the process, they're actually helping out these failed legacy corporate media outlets. So I think big tech is something we have to take head on. And I am not somebody who believes that because they're private, they can do whatever the hell they want to. They are hurting our country and they're hurting our society. And I'd say the same thing about things like critical race theory and this woke ideology that we see really sweeping a lot of different institutions. And it's not just, sometimes like these Republicans, oh, this socialism. You know, socialism, yeah, it may be that, but it's way, way more insidious and pervasive in terms of what it seeks to do to society. They are seeking, through this wokeness, to delegitimize the founding principles of this country and to delegitimize our institutions. That is what their project is. They want a society in which, as Orwell said, nothing exists except an endless present in which the party, their narrative, is always right. This is a form of cultural Marxism. They want to tear apart the fabric of our society, and they want to impose a much more radical and, I think, dangerous form of principles to be the foundational principles of our country. And I look back, when I ran for Congress in 2012, I ran primarily to stop Barack Obama, who was obviously in his first term running for re-election. And I even wrote a book, which about a dozen people have read, that kind of talked about some of the problems I saw with what he was doing, how his philosophy was not consistent with the founding of the country and our constitutional, and I stand by that, and I think those were important fights. But I also have to say, looking back on that and then looking now, it is almost kind of quaint what we were looking at back in 2012, because I think the threats to freedom are much, much more pervasive. And I think the left is much, much more aggressive than even they were just a decade ago. I mean, just think about this election. They have 50 senators and like a 4 or 5 vote majority in the House. If they had just a few more seats in either chamber, what was their agenda? They want to pack the Supreme Court. They want to abolish the Electoral College so California could elect the president every 4 years. They want to federalize ballot fraud and overrule every voter ID law in the entire country. And they want to make D.C. a state so that you can have 2 permanent, radical, left-wing Democratic senators. Now, that is not an agenda. If we go to kitchen tables throughout Middle America and think about what the families are talking about, they're not talking about making D.C. a state. They're not talking about federalizing election procedures. They're talking about inflation. They're talking about gas prices. They're talking about all these other things that are so important. So that's not an agenda that the people want. That's an agenda that their ideology is pushing them to do because they want to make conservatives second-class citizens. Ultimately, that's what they want to do. If you dissent, then you should be basically subjugated. And that's why they're looking to try to erase our history. They're taking down statues of Thomas Jefferson and Lincoln, and they'll take down George Washington's name off schools in places like California, the father of our country. They've weaponized the bureaucracy in ways that, the founders probably feared, but I don't know that we've ever quite seen until modern times in these last however many years. I mean, of course, you look at what they did with the Russia collusion was a total disaster. Very few people, actually maybe some people will be held accountable. Let's see. I didn't think so with Durham, but we've seen some. Hopefully that's building a bigger case. But, people like Comey and Brennan, they need to be prosecuted for what they did. But if you think about, we have an attorney general who is having FBI agents stake out school board meetings because they're worried about moms who are concerned about things like critical race theory and forced masking in schools. So this is a bureaucracy that's being turned against the political enemies of the regime. You look at corporate America and how they have really embraced this woke ideology. You saw what they did in Georgia with their election bill. Now, our bill was much stronger than Georgia, but what Georgia did was, to me, just obvious after what happened in their election. And the left they went nuts. The media went nuts. And so these corporations, they're getting bullied by the mob. And so they all genuflect. They all issue these statements basically saying how terrible it was. They're essentially underscoring false narratives at the expense of the people of Georgia. It cost Atlanta the All-Star game, although they won the World Series, so that's a pretty good trade. But, they're doing that. And so what I said in Florida after that happened, because our bill was going through the legislature, I said, hey, as this corporate CEO, look, it's a free country. I mean, if you want to get involved, if you want to, get involved in my election bills or some of these other things, honestly, you can do it. But just understand, when you do that, you're no longer just an economic actor. You're a political actor. And I'm going to treat you as such, and I'm fighting back against you, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. And the result was the legislature passed the bill. I signed the bill. The left had a spasm. The media had a spasm. But the businesses didn't say anything in Florida because they understood I'm not going to let them smear my people, my legislators, or me with these false narratives. Virtue signaling has a cost in the state of Florida, and the cost is me fighting back. And then finally, I think that this is something that we never thought probably, if we were here 2 years ago and I said, within the next year, you're going to have governments lock kids out of school for a year, close churches while they let liquor stores and strip clubs operate, and do all the stuff that we've seen, everyone here probably would have said, no, that's a little bit too much. And yet, we've not seen greater incursions on freedom than we have since COVID. They said it was 15 days to slow the spread. They lied. They are going to use this to do things that they wanted to do anyways. And so in Florida, we shut that down long ago, and we're not going to let it happen. But just understand, the left learned a valuable lesson from COVID. And the lesson is if you can whip up enough fear in the population, you can really push the envelope. And so that playbook will return. And so we really, as conservatives, need to understand what we're up against. You need to resolve to fight back. One of the things you have to do, particularly in a position like mine, is you need to be willing to wield power. I hear some people say we can never be involved in private business or never be involved in this. And yes, if this were the 1920s, then fine, you can just let it ride. It was a good time. But when you have freedom under assault, when you have conservatives under assault by corporate America, academia, the bureaucracy, the Democrat Party, the corporate press, big tech, all these different things, doing nothing means you're surrendering to the left, and we can never do that, not now, not in the future. And so if I have an opportunity to preserve our freedom and defend our values and protect folks' livelihoods, I use my authority to do just that. Alexander Hamilton said, energy in the executive is the leading character of good governance. And we are energetic in the state of Florida, and we will continue to be energetic in the state of Florida, but we can't have passive people that are passive and think these problems are just going to solve themselves, because they're not. We also need to make sure people are exercising leadership, and that's really without regard to the immediate political consequences. And Kay mentioned it with COVID. I mean, I was being attacked in like Asia and Europe for keeping Florida open. But I understood I have to do the right thing. And honestly, if the media is doing all this, and if people honestly believe some of the nonsense, well, at the end of the day, I would rather the price of me saving everybody's job to be I lose mine. I would trade that to protect these other people. But in reality, people understood and they appreciated just standing their ground. I have not, since I've become governor, taken a poll for anything. Not one poll. And the reason is it's expensive, and I don't like to waste money, but no, the reason is because, leadership is not about responding to a static environment. Leadership is about setting a course and then bringing the people with you. So if we have a situation where something may not seem like it's popular, that doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do, and that doesn't mean if you lead with purpose and conviction that those numbers will move and people will come behind you. The great example, when I did the schools last year, everyone said not everyone, but most were saying, the media was saying, that this was crazy, the kids were going to die. It was nonsense. I knew the data, I knew the science, and I knew how important it was to get them in school. If you had taken a poll summer of 2020, I'll bet you probably 2-1 in Florida would have opposed in-person schooling. Now, most of the parents were for it, but most of the other people, they thought, the schools are going to spread it, all that. That's not true. And so we went ahead, we did it. There was so much hysteria. And you know what? After like a month, everyone was happy. And now today, nobody will admit that they opposed me. They all claim that they supported what I did. But that's what leadership's all about, and that's what we have to be able to do it. So we've got a lot that we have to do, but I can tell you this, there's certain things that we've got to make sure to keep this ship going in a good direction where we can save the country. We cannot go back to the failed Republican establishment of yesteryear. That is gone. We cannot allow conservatism to be nothing more than warmed over corporatism. And I can tell you that the problems that we face in society are not going to be solved by cutting taxes for corporations who hate us. We cannot elect GOP office holders who are cowed by the corporate press and who accept false media narratives. You cannot let them set the definition of what's acceptable or what's not acceptable, because they will never define the rules of the game in ways that are favorable to conservatives. As we see society like we see now, that's really an Orwellian society almost, we've got to remember that the more a society becomes unmoored from the truth, the more it will attack those who dare stand up to speak the truth. And so in times like these, there's no substitute for courage. Courage to stand up against hostile political forces. Courage to stand in the face of things like cancel culture. Courage to stand up against a dishonest and corrupt corporate media. And courage to be a voice for those who are voiceless in this society. Winston Churchill, during the run-up to World War II, as he was fighting the appeasement that was going on in the British government, he told a story about when he was a kid and the circus would come to town. He loved to go, and his Nana would always tell him, "There is one act that I forbid you to see because it is just too grotesque for the human sight to see." And it was an act called the Boneless Wonder. And so Winston said, "Where is this boneless wonder now? The boneless wonder is not in the circus anymore. The boneless wonders are sitting in the front row of the House of Commons because they don't have the ability to stand up and show some spine." And so that's really what we're called on. These are tough fights. This is the road less traveled in our current societal arrangements. And it's important that people understand that and are willing to have those fights. And I think back Veterans Day, and I think all the way back to the founding of the country. You know, when the founding fathers revolted against Britain, they honestly, compared to what we face, were not facing nearly as significant incursions on freedom than we've seen in this country in the last 2 years. They were being taxed. Some of the taxes were unfair, but at the end of the day, they probably could have just dealt with it. They were all very successful. They had good lives. But, you know, they said, wait a minute, if we allow this to stand, then it's just a matter of time before our entire freedoms are taken away from us. And so they chose to take a stand when I think most people in modern society would have just said, you know what, just let it slide. And so they resolved to pledge their lives, fortune, and sacred honor. And they did it by understanding what time in history it was. They studied, before they went to frame the Constitution, the history of every republic in the history of the world. And they were trying to draw lessons from those experiments. And as they were looking at all throughout history, it dawned on people like James Madison that there was really only one thing in common that all these republics shared, and it was this: every one of them had failed. And so it became clear that it had fallen to the United States of America to determine whether people really could govern themselves, whether you could have a society based on rights being endowed by God, not by government, whether you could have a society based on the idea that laws should govern and not the whims of individual men. And they fought that fight, and they set a foundation. And on Veterans Day, we see all the people throughout the years who have stood up to fight for our way of life, for our Constitution, and for our freedom. And so if it means that we right now have to get up there and get in a tussle with some big company or have the media attack you or have all this, I mean, honestly, that is so much less than what so many people have given to give us these opportunities. And so I say this: in Florida, I will walk the line. I will stand my ground. I will not back down. And we have accomplished an awful lot in the state of Florida, but I pledge you this: we have only begun to fight. Thank you all. God bless. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all. Enjoy Orlando. Enjoy Florida. God bless.